I still remember the morning he disappeared, the way sunlight streamed across the kitchen table while I sipped my coffee, the scent of toast lingering in the air, and how nothing about that day hinted at the emptiness that would soon swallow my life. One moment he was there, smiling, brushing his fingers over mine as he promised he'd be back soon, and the next he was gone, leaving behind nothing but a cold apartment and an unanswered phone. At first I thought it was temporary, maybe work, maybe a late meeting, maybe a surprise he wanted to give me. But as hours turned into days and then into weeks, the hope that had kept me clinging to normalcy began to dissolve. The police couldn't find him, there were no calls, no messages, and even his friends seemed to have no clue. The notebook he had left behind, once innocuous with scribbled reminders and mundane notes, now felt like a cryptic puzzle, hinting at a side of him I had never seen, a world I had never been invited into. Nights were the worst. I would sit by the window, staring at the street, imagining him walking down it, imagining his voice in the apartment, imagining any explanation that would make the absence bearable. My parents tried to comfort me, offering platitudes and prayers, but nothing patched the gaping wound of not knowing. Months passed. I moved through life like a ghost, the city around me familiar yet alien, every corner a reminder that he had once been a part of it and now he was gone. And then, just when I had convinced myself the story had ended years later, I saw her. His sister. She pulled up in a black luxury car, the kind of car that gleamed in the afternoon sun, immaculate, almost impossible. She stepped out, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement, her eyes meeting mine, a strange mix of familiarity and something unreadable, and she said just 2 words, "Get in." My heart slammed against my ribs. The city seemed to hold its breath. Questions I had buried rushed to the surface. Where has he been? Why did she appear now? And why does the fear in her eyes make my blood run cold? Without waiting for my response, she opened the passenger door, her hand gesturing firmly, insistently, as if hesitation was not an option. I paused, frozen in disbelief, torn between the safety of staying in my apartment and the unbearable pull of the truth I had spent years avoiding. I glanced back at my empty home, the memories of laughter, warmth, and love flooding through me, and then at her, at the car, at the promise of answers. I knew one thing. If I didn't follow her, I might never know why he had disappeared and I might never see him again. And as I slid into the seat beside her, the engine's low growl vibrating beneath me, I felt a cold, creeping realization that this ride wasn't just toward answers. It was toward a world I wasn't prepared for. A story of betrayal, secrets, and survival that would demand everything from me. And she didn't speak again until the car glided silently onto the highway, at which point she turned slightly and said, with a voice both calm and dangerous, "You're ready to know the truth, aren't you?" The car hummed quietly beneath us as we left the familiar streets behind, the city shrinking in the rearview mirror, and with every mile I felt the weight of years pressing into my chest, the absence of my husband a constant ache that had never dulled. I kept my hands clasped in my lap, fingers twisting the edges of my skirt as the sleek leather seat beneath me offered comfort I couldn't feel. And every instinct screamed at me to ask questions, to demand answers, to beg for clarity. But something in her eyes stopped me, a quiet authority that told me this was her story to tell, her timing to decide. The highway stretched endlessly before us, and I couldn't stop thinking about the day he disappeared, the sound of his last words, the warmth of his hand slipping from mine as if he had known this day would come but had left me in the dark regardless. The sister, impeccably dressed, her posture rigid yet graceful, glanced at me only once, just long enough for me to sense her calculation, her wariness, and then returned her gaze to the road, lips pressed into a line that hinted at years of secrets held close, of truths buried beneath layers of carefully constructed lies. The silence in the car was thick, almost suffocating, and every minor sound, the turn of the wheel, the subtle hum of the engine, the occasional distant honk, felt magnified, carrying a weight that made my stomach knot with anticipation and dread. My mind reeled with possibilities. Had he been in danger? Was he alive? Had she known all along and been complicit in his disappearance? And then, just as I thought I might explode with unasked questions, she spoke, her voice calm but carrying an undercurrent that made it impossible to ignore. "He's alive, but you have to understand the world he's in now. It's not the one you knew." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat almost choking me as my mind spun with fear and hope, with relief and uncertainty all at once. I had imagined answers for years, piecing together fragments from friends, neighbors, the sparse messages he had left, But nothing had prepared me for the truth to be delivered like this, through a sister I barely knew, in a car that gleamed like a warning sign. She didn't elaborate further, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, a quiet urgency that told me the road ahead would not be safe, that the comfort of my home, of my life rebuilt, was about to be replaced with something far more complex, far more dangerous. And as the miles stretched on, the city giving way to the outskirts, shadows lengthening with the setting sun, I began to notice subtle details. The careful scanning of the road, the occasional glance at the rearview mirror that didn't seem casual, the faint tension in her shoulders that spoke volumes about the world we were entering. And then she spoke again, almost as if reading my thoughts. There are people who think he owes them more than he should. People who will come looking. I realized then that the vanishing wasn't just a personal betrayal, wasn't just abandonment. It was a survival mechanism, a choice made in a world I had never imagined existed. My fingers tightened on the edge of my skirt, knuckles white, as the car slipped down a narrow country road, the darkness pressing in from either side, and I understood that every mile we traveled was a step deeper into a life I was unprepared for. A world of wealth, influence, and danger that had remained hidden beneath the comfortable illusion of my marriage. My mind raced with every what-if I had conjured over the years, and now each scenario seemed both inadequate and terrifyingly plausible, as if the universe itself had waited all these years for me to arrive at this exact moment. And then she slowed the car, pulling into a gated driveway I had never seen, a mansion looming behind black iron gates, lights blazing against the night. The engine's low hum faded into the silence of the estate, and I realized with a jolt that the life my husband had disappeared into was luxurious, untouchable, and impenetrable, yet fraught with peril I couldn't yet comprehend. She parked and turned toward me, her expression unreadable, but her voice softened, a rare vulnerability piercing the otherwise impenetrable exterior. You have to understand, he didn't leave because he wanted to hurt you. He left because he had no choice. And in that instant, every fragment of my anger, my longing, my grief collided, creating a storm inside me that left me breathless. My lips trembled as I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come, because nothing I could ask would prepare me for the complexity of the world into which I had just stepped. She opened the door, gesturing again for me to follow, and I realized the choice I made in that moment, whether to stay or step forward, would define everything that came next. I exhaled sharply, forcing my legs to move, stepping onto the driveway, the gravel crunching beneath my feet like a drumbeat marking the beginning of a journey I had no map for, and yet an undeniable pull that I couldn't resist. And just as I approached the front door, the sister turned slightly, her gaze piercing, and whispered almost to herself, "You have no idea what you're walking into." And I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. A premonition that whatever awaited inside would shatter everything I thought I knew about love, betrayal, and survival. The door closed behind me with a soft but ominous click, and the scent of polished wood, leather, and faint perfume wrapped around me like a warning I couldn't ignore. The mansion was massive, impossibly elegant, but there was something cold about it, a sterility that suggested wealth had been built on rules I wasn't meant to question, a life constructed with hidden corridors and guarded secrets. My footsteps echoed as I followed his sister through a hall lined with expensive art, paintings that seemed to watch me as I moved, and I realized immediately that this was a world I had only glimpsed from the outside, one where danger hid behind opulence and where my husband had vanished into the labyrinth of power, influence, and fear. I wanted to ask questions, how, why, what, but the words lodged in my throat because even as my mind raced, my instincts screamed at me to wait, to observe, to understand the rules of a game I hadn't signed up for yet. She led me into a study, the room dimly lit with golden lamps that highlighted shelves of leather-bound books and files stacked with precision, and at the far end he sat. My husband. Older, his face drawn, eyes sharper, the warmth I remembered tempered by exhaustion, and in that instant, I felt both relief and a deep, gnawing unease. He looked at me, hesitation and recognition battling in his gaze, and the silence stretched, heavy and unbearable, like the pause before a storm breaks. And then his sister spoke again, firm, unwavering, "You're going to hear everything, but you need to understand that some of it will change you and there's no turning back." I nodded, though the tremor in my hands betrayed the intensity of my fear and anticipation, and I sank into a chair across from him, my heart hammering as if it knew the truth would shatter the fragile constructs I had built in his absence. He began to speak, his voice low, deliberate, and laced with the weight of years spent hiding. I disappeared because there were people who thought I owed them my life, my choices, my loyalty. There were threats I couldn't explain, consequences I couldn't shield you from. I swallowed the ache of years without him colliding with the terror of the unknown he was describing. Every word painted a picture of danger and deceit so intricate I struggled to follow, yet I could feel the truth beneath it, raw and undeniable, a puzzle where every missing piece was a risk. He described nights spent hiding, running, negotiating, protecting the ones he loved without letting them know. Decisions that had isolated him, that had left me wondering, grieving, questioning my own worth. And as he spoke, I realized that his disappearance had not been abandonment but survival, a labyrinth of choices designed to shield me from a darkness I had never imagined. But the relief I felt was short-lived, because as he outlined the threats, the enemies, the people who had sought him out for power or revenge, I understood that the danger was far from over. His sister, ever watchful, would occasionally glance at the doorway, listening, scanning, reminding me silently that we were never truly safe, that every word spoken could be overheard, every movement tracked. And then came the revelation I hadn't expected. One of the men seeking him had been someone I knew, someone who had walked among us, trusted, accepted, and now posed a risk not just to him, but to me, to the fragile world we had tried to rebuild in his absence. My breath caught, a chill running through me as memories I had buried surfaced. Hints, small moments, glances that didn't make sense at the time, all converging into the terrifying realization that his world, the one I had married into, had never been the safe, ordinary life I imagined. I wanted to cry, to run, to retreat into the safety of what little I had left, but I knew that survival demanded engagement, demanded courage I hadn't tapped into before. And as he continued, detailing the alliances he had formed, the compromises he had made, the networks of influence he had cultivated to stay alive, I began to see the depth of the man he had become. A man shaped by necessity, fear, and love. A man whose absence had been both punishment and protection. Hours passed, though it felt like moments as the story unfolded, each revelation peeling back layers of truth, each confession cutting into my heart with the sharp edge of understanding. And just when I thought I had absorbed everything, the sister turned to me, her expression unreadable, and said quietly but firmly, "There's something you need to see." She led me to another room, dimly lit, where a series of monitors displayed images of people, places, and events I didn't understand, moving in real time. He explained that the surveillance had been his lifeline, a way to anticipate threats and maintain control, and my pulse quickened as I realized that the world I had entered was not just dangerous, but omnipresent. A reality where every corner, every person, every moment could conceal peril. And as I watched, comprehension and fear intertwined in a suffocating dance, I felt the weight of years of ignorance, grief, and longing collapse into a single point. The truth of his disappearance was more complex, more frightening, and more urgent than I could have imagined. I turned to him, ready to demand answers, to seek solace, to claim the fragments of the man I had loved, but his eyes held a warning I couldn't ignore. "There's someone coming," he said simply, and the monitors confirmed it. Figures moving closer, precise, deliberate, inevitable. I realized then that this reunion, this moment of revelation, was not a haven but the prelude to a confrontation I wasn't ready for. And even as adrenaline surged and fear threatened to paralyze me, I understood that turning back was impossible. The door would open, the threat would arrive, and our choices would determine survival. My hands clenched in my lap, my heart hammering, my mind racing, and as shadows lengthened across the walls of the mansion, I whispered to myself, steadying my voice against the storm inside, ready to face whatever came next. I had just begun to comprehend the magnitude of his world when the sound came. A low, deliberate knock at the mansion's grand front door that resonated like a warning through the polished floors and high ceilings, freezing me in place with a cold shock of anticipation. My pulse raced, every instinct screaming that this was the moment the past had been preparing me for, the moment where all the secrets and lies collided with reality, where the truth of his disappearance would meet the danger he had been evading for years. His sister moved with quiet authority, her heels silent on the marble floors as she approached the door and peered through the peephole, her expression unreadable yet tense. I followed her gaze and caught a glimpse of men, 2, maybe 3, dressed in sharp suits, their eyes scanning the perimeter, professional, precise, calculated. They weren't here for words. They were here to enforce, to intimidate, to claim what they believed he owed. My stomach turned, a coil of fear twisting tighter with every heartbeat. He rose from his chair, placing a steadying hand on the backrest, his face a mask of calm determination that barely concealed the tension rippling beneath his skin. He explained quietly, almost as if speaking aloud the strategies he had rehearsed countless times in his head, that these men were part of a network that had considered him a liability, that had sought to manipulate, coerce, and control him, and that their arrival now meant our sanctuary was temporary, fleeting, fragile. The sister motioned for me to remain quiet, to stay hidden, but I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs as though it wanted to escape entirely, a frantic rhythm that mirrored the chaos of the unknown we were about to confront. And then the door opened, a slow, deliberate creak that stretched seconds into eternities, and the men stepped inside with measured steps, scanning the room, their eyes locking on us with a mixture of recognition and calculated indifference. And I realized with a jolt that their presence was not just a threat to him, but a direct test of my resolve, my courage, my capacity to face what I had long feared. He greeted them with a controlled calm, offering subtle gestures, carefully chosen words, a dance of negotiation that only someone who had survived years of peril could master. And I watched, transfixed, as the stakes of his world became tangible in a way I had never imagined. My hands clenched in my lap, nails digging into my skin as I tried to steady my racing mind, trying to parse the layers of threat and intention, and realizing that every word, every movement in this room carried weight that could mean life or death. The sister stood beside me, her presence a silent anchor, and I felt a strange mixture of gratitude and apprehension, wondering if she had orchestrated this meeting to protect me or to expose me to the reality she had warned me about. And then, the man in the center of the group stepped forward, a subtle smirk playing at his lips, and said in a tone that dripped with calculated menace, "We've been expecting you." My stomach dropped as I processed the implication. They had known where he was all along, had tracked him, had waited for this moment, and now I, unwittingly, was part of the confrontation. He rose, his expression unwavering, and calmly countered, stating that compliance and negotiation would prevent unnecessary consequences, that loyalty and protection had limits, that anyone stepping out of line would bear the results. The tension in the room became almost palpable, a thick, heavy air that pressed down on my shoulders and chest, and I could feel my own fear transforming into a keen alertness, a focus sharpened by the immediacy of the threat. I realized then that my presence mattered, not because I held power but because I represented everything he had fought to protect, everything he had hidden in his absence, and the very sight of me, alive and determined, was a symbol of stakes these men could not ignore. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time seemed irrelevant as negotiations, subtle threats, and quiet intimidation unfolded, and I was drawn into a world of strategy, psychology, and unspoken danger that made my pulse pound like a drumbeat of survival. The sister occasionally interjected, her voice cutting through the tension with clarity, redirecting questions, asserting control in a way that reminded me that even amidst fear she had authority, had plans, had knowledge I couldn't yet grasp. And then the unexpected happened. One of the men made a subtle move, a hand near his pocket, a shift in stance, and instinctively, I knew this was the moment the fragile balance could shatter. He reacted instantly, a quiet but firm command, and the room seemed to hold its breath, the atmosphere stretching tight with anticipation, the potential for violence, for catastrophe, hanging like a storm cloud. I realized in that heartbeat that the danger had never been theoretical. It had always been real, ever-present, waiting for a misstep, for hesitation, for weakness. And just when I thought the tension might break into chaos, the sister leaned toward me and whispered, her voice almost a breeze against my ear, "Remember, nothing is as it seems." My mind reeled, trying to comprehend the layers of deception, the stakes, the reasons for his disappearance, and the webs that connected loyalty, survival, and betrayal. And then, in a moment that sent a shiver down my spine, one of the men stepped back, eyes flicking toward a monitor, and I saw the recognition, the alarm, the understanding that our control of the situation was only temporary, that a larger, unseen force was at play, and that the climax of this confrontation had yet to arrive. I felt the air shift, the room vibrating with the tension of secrets about to be revealed, alliances tested, and truths exposed, and I understood with a chill that rooted me to the spot, that the next move, mine, his, hers, would define survival, trust, and the fragile remnants of a life stolen by disappearance and fear. And as shadows stretched across the walls, the luxury and elegance of the mansion now a stage for an invisible war, I whispered to myself, steadying my pulse against the storm within, knowing that the moment to act, to confront, to survive, was almost here, and that the revelations awaiting us would change everything. The room felt smaller than before, though the mansion had always been vast, and I realized it wasn't the walls confining me, but the gravity of the truth finally pressing down, tangible and suffocating. The men had paused, their sharp eyes scanning every movement, every breath, as if the slightest misstep could tip the fragile balance into chaos. My husband rose, a controlled calm masking the exhaustion beneath, and his voice carried the weight of years spent hiding, negotiating, surviving, and protecting. He began to speak, slowly, deliberately, words cutting through the thick tension. I had to disappear because my life was in danger. Every move I made, every connection I had to be calculated, or it could cost us everything. He explained alliances and betrayals, promises broken and honored in secrecy, and how his absence had been a shield rather than abandonment. My heart thudded as I listened, every revelation both relieving and terrifying. Relieving that he was alive, terrifying because the world he had navigated was so far from the ordinary life I had known, so dangerous, so intricate that my previous understanding of him seemed naive. His sister's presence was both comforting and unnerving. She had orchestrated this moment with precision, timing the confrontation perfectly, knowing when to speak, when to remain silent, when to guide me through the maze of truth and deception. And then came the moment I had been waiting for, the core question that had haunted me through sleepless nights and empty mornings. Why didn't you come back for me? His eyes softened, a flicker of remorse surfacing amidst the hardened lines of survival. I couldn't risk it, he said. I couldn't bring you into the danger, couldn't protect you while ensuring the threat stayed away. Every decision, every sacrifice had been for your safety, though it had left scars I couldn't erase. My chest tightened, grief and understanding colliding, as I absorbed that his disappearance had been a love, twisted and protective, masquerading as abandonment. But relief was fleeting. The tension returned almost immediately, heavier this time as the sister motioned subtly toward the monitors, her expression taut. The men shifted and I realized the confrontation wasn't over. The true test had only just begun. One of them stepped forward, voice calm but dangerous, questioning loyalty, testing our resolve, and I felt the pulse of fear run through me, sharp and immediate, a reminder that survival demanded presence, courage, and decisiveness. My husband responded with quiet authority, unraveling lies, exposing truths, and demonstrating a control that had been honed over years of danger. And I watched, mesmerized, feeling both pride and the weight of the enormity of his life hidden from me. And then the sister spoke, her voice carrying a steel edge. It's time she knows everything. She began to reveal layers of secrets, truths about networks, hidden dealings, and threats I hadn't imagined. And as the words sank in, I realized the complexity of the world he had entered, the magnitude of his disappearance, and the risks that had been shadowing us all these years. I wanted to retreat, to curl into the familiarity of grief I had carried for so long, but there was no turning back. The stakes were now fully revealed, and my survival, my understanding, my trust, depended on facing what lay ahead. And just as I processed the depth of betrayal, danger, and love intertwined, the sister glanced at me, her gaze sharp yet fleetingly gentle, and said, "They're not finished yet." A shiver ran down my spine as I realized that while immediate danger had passed, the implications, the alliances, and the consequences of years spent hidden would continue to shape our lives, our decisions, and our future. And then my husband leaned closer, his voice soft but firm, promising that together we could navigate what remained, but I sensed the truth behind his words. The journey of understanding, of rebuilding, of surviving was only beginning. And as the sun set behind the mansion, casting long shadows across the room, I felt the weight of the past years lift slightly, replaced by anticipation, uncertainty, and the faint, burning hope that finally the pieces might come together. My hands shook, my heart pounded, and I whispered silently to myself, ready for what would come next, knowing the revelations were far from over, and that the final truths, the ultimate answers, would demand everything I had left to give. The mansion was quiet now, but the silence carried a weight heavier than any noise I had ever known. A lingering echo of the confrontation, the secrets, the danger, and the years spent waiting for answers that had finally arrived. I stood by the window, watching the lights of the city stretch into the distance, each flicker a reminder of life continuing outside this bubble of revelation and uncertainty. My husband's presence beside me was both comforting and disorienting. He looked older, changed by the trials he had endured, yet familiar enough that my heart could still recognize him. We had spoken for hours, peeling back layers of truth, lies, and omission, and with each revelation my understanding of him and the man I had married expanded, complicated, and reshaped itself. I realized that the person I thought I knew had been living in a parallel reality, one built on necessity, fear, and survival, a life that had demanded sacrifices I could scarcely imagine. His sister, who had guided me through the labyrinth of truth, remained close but reserved, a silent guardian ensuring that every step I took toward comprehension was measured and safe. The luxury, the power, the networks, the hidden dangers, they all existed, yes, but they were only the surface. Beneath it lay the human story. The fear, the love, the regrets, the endless calculation, the guilt, the longing. And as I listened to him recount decisions I could never have made, I felt a strange mixture of grief, awe, and relief. The grief for the years lost, the awe at the resilience and intelligence that had kept him alive, and the relief that he had returned whole and alive to the life we had built, fractured though it now was. But relief was fragile, and the shadows of the past remained. The sister had warned me, hinted at lingering threats, at unfinished business, and I understood that our reunion, our reconciliation, was only the beginning of navigating the consequences of absence, secrecy, and the invisible forces that had shaped his choices. I walked through the mansion, touching the polished surfaces, feeling the weight of stories, histories, and decisions embedded into every corner. I thought of the years I had spent wondering, grieving, imagining, hoping, and the stark contrast of the present reality hit me with a clarity that was almost painful. And yet, amid the danger and complexity, I found a quiet moment of reflection. I realized that I had changed too, not the naive, dependent woman who had waited helplessly, but someone who had survived absence, heartbreak, and uncertainty. I had learned patience, discernment, resilience, and the ability to step into the unknown when necessary, to trust my instincts, and to accept truths that were uncomfortable but real. My husband approached, resting a hand lightly on my shoulder, and I felt the years of tension and distance dissolve slightly in that simple gesture. He spoke softly, apologetically, and for the first time, the weight of his absence seemed to lift, replaced by a tentative bridge of understanding. I asked questions, many questions, and each answer, though difficult, helped to weave the fragmented pieces of our story back together. The sister interjected occasionally, her presence a quiet reminder of the vigilance necessary to navigate the reality he had inhabited, and I began to see the delicate balance of trust, protection, and survival that had guided every decision. The sun began to rise, light spilling through the massive windows, painting the walls with gold, illuminating the mansion, the truth, and the fragile threads of connection we were slowly reconstructing. And I felt for the first time in years, a sense of cautious hope, knowing that while danger and secrets still lingered, while the scars of absence and betrayal could never fully disappear, there was a possibility for healing, for understanding, for rebuilding. I reflected on the journey that had brought me here, the years of emptiness, the sleepless nights, the unanswered questions, the glimpses of hope, and the terrifying moments that had demanded courage I hadn't known I possessed. And I understood that my husband's disappearance had not been just a story of loss, but also of protection, resilience, and love disguised as absence. The sister spoke one last time, a quiet note of reassurance, reminding me that while the future was uncertain, we had survived, and survival was its own kind of triumph. And as I stood there, looking out at the city, feeling the warmth of his presence beside me, I realized that this was not the end of our story but a rebirth, an opportunity to navigate the complexities, the dangers, and the fragile beauty of life with eyes open, hearts resilient, and a connection forged through absence, fear, and ultimately truth. And even as relief washed over me, I knew that vigilance, understanding, and trust would be the currencies of the days ahead, that the shadows of the past could never be fully erased, and that the journey of love, survival, and emotional reconciliation was just beginning. And in the quiet of that morning, I whispered to myself, steadying my racing heart, ready for whatever came next, finally understanding that survival, love, and truth could coexist, even in the most fractured of lives. Please follow me for no reason.